Okay, so I think that's time to start. So we'll have the last talk of today. This last talk will be given by Eric Dauxois from the University of Washington in the United States, on the west coast of United States, though very early in the morning for him. So we will talk about separating waves and turbulence in stratified oceanic flows. So Eric, the floor is yours.
Hi. Sorry I can't be there. Sorry we can't be all together, but that's just the way it works. I'm going to talk about a mixing in the ocean interior. First part of the talk will be basically try to familiarize with well-known things. The ocean is a complicated place, and I'm only going to be talking about a small part of that complication. And the rest of the talk is a little bit more speculative and which we try to talk about what's the relative roles of waves and turbulence and how you would tell. This is a cartoon from Steve Thorpe's books, which I recommend if you are interested in this topic more broadly. So why is mixing important in the large scale view of the ocean? On the global scale, and we care a lot about the global scale of the ocean for climate reasons now, mixing plays a really important part in the sequestration of CO2 into the ocean. And this is how it works. So this is one half of the world. One thing that oceanographers do is they do long sections with the ship. These guys started in Iceland and with a few breaks ended up in Antarctica. And this is a section of temperature. You can see it's cold in the south and cold in the north and warm at the equator. And you see the temperature in the deep ocean down to 6 kilometers depth here. You see these plumes of extra cold water here, medium cold water coming here, and not so much here. Also, if you look at oxygen, which is high at the poles here and here, you see a plume of oxygen coming here, a plume of oxygen coming here, and these plumes, not in a straight line, but move toward the equator and then past it. And the question you might ask is, how does the water get back up? It's going down here pretty clearly. How does it get back up? And the answer is it gets back up by mixing. So if there were no mixing, the deep ocean would be, this process would stop and the deep ocean would be separated from the surface ocean. And so it's these deep plumes of water which are driven and maintained by the mixing back up again, which take surface water, move it into the deep ocean, and that's where the CO2 that we put into the atmosphere, about a good fraction of it, like a third or something, ends up in the ocean in these plumes. And this is driven by mixing. And this whole process of filling up the whole ocean with water takes centuries for the whole world. We know how much mixing there is at this point in the ocean reasonably well. The deep ocean is about has a diffusivity of about 10 to the minus 4 meters squared per second, which is a pretty small number. And the upper ocean has a number more like 10 to the minus 5, which is an even smaller number. And we understand that basically from microstructure measurements. So I'm going to talk about the processes which do that. The processes which do this mixing in the simplest way is turbulence. And so I'm going to talk about turbulence. I'm going to talk about the role of turbulence, the role of waves, and then more things about their interaction. So I'm going to start with turbulence. Of course, a word that everybody knows and nobody can define. So I'm not going to talk about it in detail, mostly talk about some particular properties which will be relevant for this talk. So one of the primary properties of a turbulent flow is that energy in scalars like temperature or salinity are cascaded from large scales. In other words, you put energy in at large scales, like from the large scale winds or from in a laboratory thing for a big pump, where the flow is forced to small scales where the energy is dissipated. The scalar variance is dissipated by viscosity and diffusion. Or it takes these differences, hot water here, cold water over there, mixes them up. The turbulence does both of those things. One of the most useful properties of turbulence is that if the flow is sufficiently energetic and homogeneous, then the velocity spectra, wave number spectra of velocity, have what's called a universal Kolmogorov inertial subrange with a spectral slope of -5/3. This was first clearly demonstrated in the ocean. In fact, a place that looks much like this picture back here, where this is wave number, this is energy as a function of wave number, and the spectral slope is -5/3 over many decades. And out here is where it's dissipated, and this is the inertial subrange. This was done by a famous paper in 1962, and it's really the start of quantitative ocean turbulence research. The important thing about this inertial subrange is that if you know the level of the spectrum, how much energy there is at a given scale, then you know the rate, then the flux. So you can get from rate to flux. That's an important thing. And this concept is going to show up in this talk a lot. Any place you see a green line in this talk, it will be because there's an inertial subrange of some sort there. Okay, so this is actually, again, very close to the place that those measurements were named. It's up in British Columbia. I believe the bottom part, can you see the United States in this slide, or is the bottom of it cut off?
It's cut off at the bottom. We can see Canada.
Okay, that's unfortunate. Because you're going to miss the bottom. You're going to miss the bottom of these slides. Let me fix something for a moment. Okay, so now you should see it. You should see a lot more of my screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, and we're going to make that bigger.
But I guess it's not the right talk. It's Lagrangian.
Yeah, I see. The problem is that maybe your screen size and my screen size are different. Okay, that's unfortunate. Well, we're gonna go like this because at least you have to see this. You have to see the whole slide, or it's not going to work. You're just going to see extra stuff. So this is
in this case.
Okay, so this is a place up in British Columbia, which is where those grant measurements were made, and this is what it looks like. And if there's not much wind, and the whole surface of the ocean is boiling, and like it looks like a boiling pot, and you can see all the boils and things. And that's what a fully turbulent flow looks like. And even more dramatically, there are these big whirlpools. Those are really big logs. And those big logs are being sucked down into that whirlpool. So if you had a life preserver, it wouldn't help. You'd still be drowned. The point is that most of the ocean is not like this because the turbulence in the ocean is very much weaker than this very special situation. And it's also much more patchy. Most places in the ocean are not turbulent. In fact, most places in the ocean are laminar, and they're full of internal gravity waves. And so this is about internal gravity waves. Okay, internal gravity waves are a well-known fluid dynamical thing. They're easy to do lots of algebra and stuff on. The simple properties of them is that their frequency is always between n, the buoyancy frequency, and f, the inertial frequencies. And there are special relationships for internal gravity waves between the various quantities like velocity and vertical displacement and the frequency in the wave number, which I'll get to in a bit. The 1970s and part of the 80s were the golden years of internal gravity waves because that's when all of this stuff was being discovered. And what these observations show is anywhere you go on the ocean, you will find energetic oscillations in the internal wave frequency band. And these have many scales in frequency and wave number and big inertial component. I demonstrate that here. This is the depth of an isopycnal. And so that's about an hour. And you can see lots of wiggles on small scales. And you can see lots of wiggles on big scales. You guys can see my mouse, right?
Yes, Eric.
Yes.
Okay, good. You see lots of wiggles on small scales that are only a few minutes long, and you can see oscillations on much larger scales also. There's a broad band of internal waves here. You can also, if you do a vertical profiling from the surface to the bottom of the ocean, this is one component like east, and this component is the north. You can see these large scale motions. Those aren't gravity waves. Those are geostrophic eddies. But you can also see smaller scale fluctuations. Those are waves. And in this particular case, there were two profiles taken half an inertial period apart. And you can see very strong mirroring. Namely, there's a strong inertial frequency component of velocity in these motions, and not a very strong component near n. These are significantly strong motions. 10-meter displacements are typical. 10 centimeter a second currents are typical, sometimes very much bigger. And these motions, although they're not big in displacement, are dominant looking at shear, and things like Richard's number are dominated by internal wave fluctuations. And because of that, we expect that they have an important role in mixing. And we'll talk about that for a moment, in a moment. How do we know these are gravity waves? There was a lot of confusion at the beginning. People thought maybe it really was turbulence, but it's not. And the reason we think that they're gravity waves is due to what's called internal wave consistency relationships. In other words, you take the equations of motion, you say, what are the relationships between different quantities? And in particular, one that's turned out to be, one of many that's turned out to be useful is the ratio of vertical kinetic energy to horizontal kinetic energy. And if you work out the equations for simple internal gravity waves, that ratio was only a function of frequency, which means you can estimate it from a single point measurement, which is very useful. Here's the function that it is of frequency. And here's an illustration of a flow that passes the test. This is frequency in this axis. This is a velocity on this axis as a spectrum. This is the horizontal components of velocity. This is the vertical components of velocity. That's the buoyancy frequency, and you can see it falls off very rapidly at the buoyancy frequency, which is a little bit spread out, which is why it isn't exactly in the right place. And you can see that this slope is -2 and this slope is white. And if you take the kinetic energy and compute what the horizontal kinetic energy and compute what the vertical kinetic energy should be, that's the black line, and the black line indeed agrees with the blue line, so it passes the test. These sort of tests, this sort of argument was taken to great lengths in the 70s. The classic paper on that is this paper on the IWEX spectrum from 78, a very elaborate and detailed test. But taken all together, the result of this is that for frequencies between F and N, the motions are mostly, but not entirely, internal waves. So given that,
Eric, if you don't mind, you can try the slideshow mode once more just to see if we can.
Okay, it's work to break out of that. Well, so for now it's okay.
Yeah.
Yes.
We'll see what happens as we go on.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, good. So yeah, the idea that these really were gravity waves led to the next big contribution to this, which is a thing called the Garrett Mug Spectrum, which will be in these slides often called GM spectrum. Which is that there is a universal internal gravity wave spectrum, universal shape for internal gravity waves in the ocean, similar in many ways to the inertial subrange, but it's not inertial subrange, it's different dynamics. And if you take what happened is at the end of the 70s mostly, many types of internal wave measurements, vertical profiles, horizontal profiles, velocity, displacement, anything you want. If you take them all and put them all on one plot, you can collapse them all to within a factors of 2 or 3 mostly, to a single spectrum, which is consistent with internal wave dynamics. This is an illustration in log space of frequency in this direction. So there's F, there's N, and vertical wave number in this direction, and the height is how much energy there is. And this is what the spectrum looks like. There's various variations of them, which are all similar. There's a big peak at the inertial frequencies. Most of the energy is over here in the low vertical mode number and low frequencies. In other words, inertial mode 1, mode 2 is a lot of the energy, and not much energy down here at near N waves and small vertical scales. There are some clear exceptions to this. I believe you heard some talks earlier in this seminar on strong internal gravity waves in coastal regions, very strong solitons or solitary waves. That leads to a huge peak over here with lots of energy, but those don't happen in most places. So most of the energy is up here, but most of the shear is down here at the small scales. The spectrum is roughly white in vertical wave number for shear, but still at low frequencies. So the energy is at low modes and low frequencies, and the shear is at high modes and low frequencies. And it's this small scale stuff down here, which is what drives the mixing. So how do you get from internal waves to mixing? Well, the Garrett Mug spectrum, it turns out, is shaped by nonlinear wave-wave interactions, quasi-linear, third order, but a bunch of papers on that, and that work is continuing both numerically and analytically. It's a it's an important area. And the way that energy moves is from where the energy is up at near inertial low modes down to near inertial high modes, and from over here also to near inertial, near inertial low modes to near inertial high modes, and any other frequencies up here to near inertial high modes. So there's a transfer of energy towards small scales, but still keeping mostly near inertial frequencies. The rules which govern how fast this goes are understood, and they fall in the category of fine scale parameterizations. Mike Gregg was the first one to do that in '89, and there's a nice review paper, big effort by Jen McKinnon in a paper in 2017. And the important property is that energy moves, as I said, from large scales to small scales, and the rate that energy moves is proportional to the internal wave energy squared, not the energy. The internal wave energy squared, that will be important. And that means that if you measure the energy levels at intermediate frequencies or wave numbers here, you can get the rate, just like you could with three-dimensional turbulence. You measure the level and you can get a rate. What that means is that this flux of energy from here to here is controlled by internal wave physics, not turbulence physics. And you can measure it from measuring things both at the turbulence scales and also at these intermediate scales. And this has led to all sorts of wonderful results, which I'll show you in a minute. The resulting mixing in the ocean is not fully turbulent. It's highly intermittent. Here's an example of that. This is a section somewhere. I don't know where I got this figure anymore. This is a few meters in the vertical, a few kilometers in the horizontal. Little black blobs are where there is significant mixing. And you see it's all very patchy, but only a small fraction of the ocean is turbulent at any given time. It's the sum of all these little patches that result in the net mixing. Otherwise, the ocean is mostly laminar. So here's the big picture. This is the synthesis, mostly from this paper by Jen McKinnon in 2017 and other stuff, of how we think mixing in the ocean works. The large scales in the ocean and the atmosphere drive, for example, barotropic tides. They drive geostrophic flows in the ocean, and there's wind. The combination of the barotropic tides and the geostrophic flows interacting with the bottom topography generate internal tides, in other words, internal waves of tidal frequency at a rate of about 1.5 terawatts globally, which is enough to sustain the mixing that we know occurs. And the wind generates near inertial internal waves at a rate that's a little bit smaller, we think. Both the internal tides and the near inertial waves are dominated by low frequency, low mode motions. And those have pretty large group velocities of order a meter a second, which means that they can propagate horizontally. And that's why there is internal waves everywhere, because these low modes can propagate all around the ocean. No matter where the sources are, the energy gets spread out a long way through the ocean. These motions non-linearly interact to make what's called an internal wave continuum. The internal wave continuum is this broad Garrett Mug spectrum here. And the rates that go from here to here are given by these fine scale parameterizations, which I talked about. The internal wave continuum, and particularly the high wave number end of it, is what contains the shear, low frequency, high mode. These waves have very small group velocities. They don't go anywhere, but they're feeding their energy from the larger waves. And that's what moves the energy to mixing. How does it get from here to here? We don't know. Well, I'll get to that in a little bit. And that leads to these known internal ocean interior mixing rates, which are higher near the bottom because the internal tides are being generated near the bottom. The other critical part of this story is we know these rates and we know these rates, and therefore we know this rate, even though we don't understand this process very well. And if you have an energy rate and you have an efficiency of mixing, then you can compute a diffusivity. That's how we get these numbers. 20% mixing efficiency gives you roughly the right diffusivity numbers. And the equation for that is that the diffusivity is that 20% times the energy flux from here to here divided by the buoyancy frequency squared. a big area for research right now is that this mixing efficiency probably isn't 20%, and we don't know quite what it is because we don't understand this process. So that's the large scale synthesis that we understand. And I'm going to talk about aspects of that now. So, but what that synthesis has led to is lots of useful results. Here's an example. This is the spreading of internal wave tidal energy. This is, you can compute the amplitude of internal tides from altimetry, it turns out. Really amazing. And you can see there's quite a bit of variation. Here's the Hawaiian Ridge, and you can see beams of internal waves coming out. This isn't a model. This is actually data. It's amazing. You can see places in the Western Pacific also, some places in the Indian Ocean. You can also see places where the internal tides are, or you can see there's a little bit in the Bay of Bengal. You can also see places where the internal tides are quite weak. Over here, in parts of the Bay of Bengal. You can also see spreading of near inertial energy. The strong winds at mid latitudes in mid latitude wind band here and in the mid latitude wind band here create near inertial energy, and it propagates equatorward as shown by these arrows. That's why you get energy here, even in internal waves here, even though there isn't a lot of wind here. From the fine scale parameterizations, you can compute the diffusivity on global scales. Here's a map of that. Some places it's high, some places it's low, some places there isn't enough data to compute it. And for example, in the Bay of Bengal, in the upper kilometer, the mixing rates are quite small as predicted here, and that appears to be indeed the case. So we know quite a bit about this from all this decades of work. So now for some other ideas on this. So the turbulence and the internal waves both have a universal spectrum, but the energy flux scales rather differently. For the waves, the energy flux is proportional to the wave energy squared, but for the turbulence, it's more for a stratified flow, it's more like the turbulent energy times the buoyancy frequency. In other words, there's only one time scale, the buoyancy frequency, and you take the energy, multiply it by that, and that's how turbulence scales in a turbulent sense, not in a wave-like sense. So if we start out with some waves and we start making the wave energy bigger and bigger, then eventually the waves can't be linear anymore, and you switch over from a quadratic dependence on energy to a linear dependence on energy. That should be some sort of a transition, which I've called the wave turbulence transition. And that's what I'm going to be talking about for the rest of this talk. What do we know about that? What energy levels does it occur at? And what's the dynamics of that? This is old work from 2000, 20 years ago, but I've seen hardly any discussions of it or exploration of these ideas, and I thought it would be worth reviving it. Maybe that's because they're bad ideas, or maybe it just sort of fell through one of the holes of history. So now we're going to do what I call spectral carpentry, looking at these various spectra and figuring out how they fit together. Okay, another thing we know, if you look over here, another thing we know is what the vertical wave number spectrum of turbulence is. So this is the spectrum of horizontal shear, not velocity. As you recall, the Garrett Mug spectrum, this slope here is -2 in velocity, in energy, which means it's white in shear. You multiply by k squared to get shear from energy. And so the shear spectrum is white between the lowest mode in the ocean, more or less. And there's a high wave number limit. That's when the total shear in the ocean is about n, i.e. the Richard number is about 1. So there's a boundary between the lowest mode that's allowed and to be nonlinear, to be internal waves, and the highest mode that's allowed to be that here, and it's roughly white between here, which means most of the shears at the high wave numbers, which is what we know. Out here in the turbulent regime, there's an inertial subrange. Inertial subrange is -5/3 in velocity, so it's +1/3 in shear. And here's an inertial subrange, -5/3, and it falls off at the Kolmogorov wave number. And we know about that. This is what microstructure measures. This is what internal wave measures. And there's a mystery region in between. Here's an example of that in data from a paper by by Mike Gregg and his students. Down here at low wave numbers, it's more or less white with a lot of variability. Up here at high wave numbers, there's an inertial subrange and a Kolmogorov fall off. And this -1 spectrum is shown by the dotted blue line. This has a very peculiar and very important property. This is the same spectrum, but now let's suppose we take that spectrum here, that's that spectrum there, and we start increasing the energy. So we go from this energy to that energy. Say that was a factor of 2. That means that the internal wave energy increased by a factor of 2. Out here in the turbulent domain, the Kolmogorov spectrum, the flux increased by a factor of 4 because the flux is the energy squared. So this goes up by a factor of 2. That means this has to go up by a factor of 4. And so as you keep on raising this line here catches up with this one and at a certain energy level, they merge. And if you work that out, it turns out that the way this actually works is all these curves slide up this -1 line. In other words, that's what happens by imposing this red spot as being Richardson number 1. And so as the energy level goes up, the wave number, which you can have, which it can be linear, gets smaller. The bandwidth of the internal waves decreases as the energy goes up. And at this point here, the bandwidth goes to 0. There aren't any more linear internal waves, and you've made a transition to a turbulent domain. Another way of saying that is that if you put energy into a wave, and watch what happens. Well, if you put a little bit of energy into the wave oscillates and it does nonlinear stuff and it makes a whole lot of other waves and makes a broad spectrum. If you put a whole lot of energy into the wave breaks right away and you go directly to turbulence. This is the case where you put a little bit of energy into the wave and you get this waves, and then turbulence at small scales. This is the case that you've made a really big wave, really strong, and then you just get turbulence. And the wave turbulence transition occurs right at that energy level. Okay, that's interesting. There's another way to look at this, and this is sort of my other contribution to this. That is looking at this whole system in a Lagrangian frame. These are instruments that I build. They're called Lagrangian floats, and their purpose is to measure Lagrangian trajectories in the ocean. They're about 1 meter in scale. There are different versions of them, and I'm going to talk about the most modern version. They can automatically adjust their buoyancy to match that of the water as measured by instruments, CTDs on the top and the bottom of the float. They have satellite communications. They have a flag so you can find them. It's a tricky thing to do it really well. You need to get the float that weighs about 50 kilograms accurate in its buoyancy to a few grams, which is a tricky thing to do. And depending on how we use them, they can stay out in the ocean for months, or we can use them on very short deployments. You can operate them in 2 fundamentally different modes. One is operating as isopycnal following a density surface in the ocean. Here's an example of that. So this is a float that was put into a very big, very energetic near-end gravity wave in the South China Sea. The displacement of this wave is about 160 meters, and you can see that the float goes down to 160 meters, comes back up again in about 5 minutes. As cartooned here, we can measure the density, and we can see that the float actually, that the float stays on that isopycnal through the whole time, despite vertical velocities of almost 50 centimeters a second. So that shows it following an isopycnal quite nicely, and that works well. Another example you can use them is in a turbulent flow. This figure down here is a composite of floats in a boundary layer, upper ocean boundary layer that's convecting. This is daytime here, nighttime here. At night, the ocean surface is cooling. You get convection in an increasingly deep mixing layer. And these are trajectories of floats in that layer. You can see that they're going down to the bottom of the layer That's what happens in convection. The water gets cold, it goes down to the bottom layer, comes back up, gets cold again, does it over and over again. And you can see that we've mapped out the properties and the energetics of this convecting boundary layer quite well. So these things can compute Lagrangian trajectories. And now you can say, well, what then are the turbulence, what are the Lagrangian properties of turbulence? There's a Lagrangian version of the Kolmogorov -5/3 spectrum. Same idea, but instead of looking at velocity, we're going to look at vertical, we're going to look at velocity not as a function of wave number, but as a function of frequency. Turns out that epsilon has the same dimensions as the acceleration spectrum as a function of frequency. So they're just proportional to each other with a Kolmogorov constant that we now know. And if you take a whole bunch of float measurements in tidal channels, like I showed you at the beginning up in Canada, and also ocean boundary layers, and you plop them all on top of each other, you see this sort of situation, all of which have a large eddy frequency here and an inertial subrange that's roughly white with some instrumental effects, which we can correct for, and then noise, of course. And if you shoot off these epsilons that you get from measuring the acceleration spectrum against epsilons that you get from the -5/3 law in the same place, you get a very good correlation over more than 4 orders of magnitude. So this really does seem to work. There really does seem to be a universal Kolmogorov spectrum for acceleration from Lagrangian measurements. And here's the paper in which we did that work. So remember I said that the interesting thing about the wave turbulence transition is what happens if you push an internal wave really, really hard. And it sort of breaks right away. So we wanted to go to a place like that. And the place we went to, it was Knight Inlet, also in British Columbia, Canadian coast. This is a long, skinny mountain fjord. It's a beautiful place. Up at this end here, which is the landward end, there's a glacier and water comes into the thing, so it's into the fjord, so it's very strongly stratified. And here there's a sill that goes up to about 70 meters. There's a section across the sill in an acoustic sounder, and the flow is hydraulically controlled over this sill, and it makes all sorts of amazing stratified flows. This is a supercritical flow with Kelvin-Helmholtz billows here. This comes down here and makes great big internal waves. Here's a bunch of flow trajectories. You see it comes over the sill, it's supercritical. There's a hydraulic jump here with big internal lee waves that are formed. All just the most complicated, detailed mess of waves and turbulence all mixed up together at very high energies. So we thought, let's look at this place and see what happens in terms of what the Lagrangian properties are. Although that wasn't actually what we were thinking about when we went, but nevertheless, that's the analysis afterwards. It was a very fun cruise with David Farmer from that part of the world. What do the vertical velocity spectra look like? So if you go far away from the sill, way up more toward the head of the inlet, you're in a situation where you only have waves. And in that situation, the spectra that you see look like the ones you see in the open ocean for vertical velocity. They are white, like Garrett Mug should be, up to N, and then it falls off. And the level is remarkably similar to the Garrett Mug level, even though we're in a fjord, which just speaks to how strong the wave-wave interactions are, that you get a level that's even similar to that. So that this is not at all unexpected. It's white and then it falls off, and you don't see a lot of evidence for turbulence here because the turbulence is very weak, far away from the sill. If you go to the sill, the energy is 100 times higher, and you look at the vertical velocity spectrum, and you see at high frequencies above N, you see a turbulent inertial subrange. You see a -2 spectrum. -2 slope, just like you should, in a nice long range. And so you say this is turbulence. That makes sense. And then you see also a white spectrum up here. You say, what the heck is that? Here we have something that looks just like this with a transition at N. Are these waves? Are they turbulence? It's very strongly forced. It has wave-like properties. what's going on here? This seems very mysterious. If you look in detail, sometimes you see a peak here, which if you look at particular pieces of particular trajectories, presumably that's nonlinear internal waves, near N waves, and some of the hydraulic things have a peak near N. So the question I'm going to be addressing, and this has a lot to do with separating waves and turbulence, is in this sort of strongly forced stratified flow, what's the nature of the flow here at high energy where you've got strongly forced waves? What's their dynamics? So there is a wave turbulence transition in Lagrangian space also. It looks like this. So this is now frequency, and this is vertical velocity spectrum. The internal waves live between F and N. There's a low frequency N and a high frequency N, just like there was in wave number, a low wave number and a high wave number N. The spectrum's roughly white and then falls off near F because of the rotation of the Earth. So that doesn't apply very much in night inlet. And if you look at low energy situations, like here, you have a white spectrum, like I showed you, falls off at N. And if there is some turbulence, you expect it to have a -2 spectrum at a level far below the level here, like you would get in the low energy part of night inlet. Once again, if you take this spectrum and you increase it by a factor of 2, this one goes up by a factor of 4, and therefore eventually they meet, and there's what it looks like when they meet, like I showed you in the last slide. And then this is the question, what happens next? What happens if I raise the energy up higher than that? Well, one thing that could happen would be that the turbulent energy just keeps going up. And so the energy goes up here instead of staying flat. But that's not what you see. What you see is this spectrum and this spectrum are pinned. That means that it's not, this part here isn't raising linearly, quadratically anymore. It's rising linearly, controlled by this. And if you work out the math, it turns out that the dissipation rate is 0.6 n times the vertical velocity squared. That comes from the shape of the spectrum and the Kolmogorov constant of the Lagrangian spectrum here. And the number 0.6 is the same number as you get out of Melo-Yamada or other similar turbulence closures, quite independently, which is pretty amazing. It's also pretty amazing that when you work out the energy level where this spectrum hits that spectrum, hits this spectrum, that happens at exactly the same energy level within 10 or 20%, as we saw for this case, with rather different results. So it all seems to work out together pretty well. And well, if this level here is associated with the high N limit of Melo-Yamada, what would turbulence theory tell you? Turbulence theory would tell you that this is buoyancy modified turbulence. It's stratified turbulence. There's a whole huge literature about that. You say, well, the turbulent motions, instead of being 3-dimensional or only 2-dimensional, they're the vertical components suppressed by stratification. And so maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's waves, maybe it's buoyancy modification. What's going on here? Okay, so just to summarize this part, of the talk about the wave turbulence transition, if you plot energy of a flow with stratification on this axis, and you plot dissipation on this axis over a wide range spanning waves and turbulence, you see a slope of +2 here and a slope of +1 here. The transition occurs when the energy reaches about the phase speed of the lowest mode, which is another way of saying the Richardson number's about 1. What actually is this energy? Well, it's a strong function of depth because the phase velocity of the low mode is a strong function of depth. If you're in the open ocean, it happens at an energy level of about 100 times the Garrett Mug level at an epsilon of about 10 to the -5 watts per kilogram, which is a pretty big number. That's typical of boundary layers. in the ocean. And so that's only going to happen in places which are very energetic. However, in shallow water, it only happens at 10 times, say 100 meters depth. It only happens at 10 times the Garrett Mug level and at dissipation rates of 10 to the minus 7, which is quite achievable. So that perhaps explains why typically shallow, among other reasons, that why shallow water is less wave-like and more turbulent-like. In shallow water mixing, people tend to talk about turbulence, and open ocean turbulence people tend to talk about waves. It's probably got to do with this issue here.
Sorry,
Okay.
There's a question on the chat.
Please.
The question is by Srileka. The question: what processes lead to increase in the wave energy in the open ocean?
Oh, that's for example, near Hawaii here, you have strong tides going over a quite shallow ridge, and that creates very strong lee waves, similar to what you get in night inlet. These radiate out, that's with these rays here. And so in the regions very close to Hawaii, I expect you're above the wave turbulence transition. That would be perhaps one of the stronger examples. Also in places where you have very strong wind forcing, for example, you might get that. Or also perhaps focusing of some of these beams, like on continental shelves. Here you get open ocean internal waves propagating onto the shelf. As the water shallows, the energy gets more and more energetic. Those are examples of how you would get variations in the internal wave amplitude. Whoops. Okay. So we had these internal wave consistency relations, which have historically been used to figure out that a flow is either waves or not flat waves. Let's apply that to this framework. And again, in the context of night inlet, because we have very large dynamic range. So for low energy conditions in night inlet, not near the sill, far away from the sill, we can measure not only vertical velocity from these floats to get the vertical velocity by how much they go up and down. These floats were also acoustically tracked, so we could measure horizontal velocity relative to the Earth. And here are spectra from the east and north components of velocity at low energy. Garrett Mug spectrums in orange. As you saw before, it's roughly Garrett Mug down here, and even this is roughly Garrett Mug. So this is, pretty amazing that works. And there's no energy. There's no energy above N. There isn't much turbulence to be seen here. And not unexpectedly, the horizontal velocities, if you compute what the vertical velocity should be, given internal wave consistency relationships, it pretty much lines up with what you see, which says that these are indeed internal waves. In fact, it's remarkably similar to the open ocean, even though this is a fjord, it's not like the open ocean at all. And so apparently the wave-wave interactions here are strong enough to get Garrett Mug-like spectrums, even in a place that's quite different from when it was originally found. Now, instead of being in the low energy part, let's go to the high energy part. Same plot. This is near the sill. It isn't that different. The biggest difference is if you look, here's the buoyancy frequency, here's N. If you look at frequencies above N, which can't be internal waves, but can be turbulence, you have three components, U, V, and W. They all have the same level. That's isotropy. And they all have a -2 slope, which is an inertial subrange. So this sure as heck looks like isotropic turbulence. And so I'm going to interpret as that. If you look, and so this is clearly above the wave turbulence transition because the spectrum is continuous across N, like this. If you look at the horizontal velocities and you compute what the vertical velocity should be in black, it still comes out right. So so this would say by this rule that this is internal waves, maybe with a little bit of excess energy at the peak associated with the hydraulics. In other words, despite the fact that the flow over Night Inlet is got a hydraulic jump and it's supercritical, and there's all sorts of Kelvin-Helmholtz instabilities and all sorts of very, very not linear things going on. If you just look at it grossly like this, it still looks like internal waves. And the naive interpretation of this is that all motions with frequency greater than n are turbulence, and all motions with frequency less than n are internal waves, and there's nothing else. That's a pretty powerful claim. What about all the other things that are happening? What about the stratified isotropic turbulence? What about the fact that the energy level agrees with turbulence theory? I don't know the answer to this. This is why it's an interesting thing and why I'm bringing it up again. Okay, that's a question. There isn't an answer, except that it's extremely intriguing. Okay, let's for the final thing here, let's look not at velocity, but at smaller scale stuff, the shear containing scales of the waves. Now, the consistency relationships relating vertical kinetic energy to horizontal kinetic energy apply equally well to their vertical derivatives. In other words, the shear, the vertical variation of horizontal shear, or the vertical variation, vertical variation of horizontal velocity, or the vertical variation of vertical velocity. Those are called shear and strain rate. Let's look at those. Maybe there'll be some insight from that. And this is a different set of data, not that energetic, off the Oregon coast between California and Washington State on the west coast of the United States. And this was, again, fairly old data. We had a float, and it had density measurements in the top and the bottom. So by looking at the difference between those and the variation of the difference over about a meter, you can measure dW, dz. It had what's called a pulse-pulse coherent sonar on it, which gives you velocity up here. And that velocity is relative to the float. And so that gives you a shear of du, dz of a difference also of about a meter. And let's apply the consistency relationships to du, dz and dv, dz and dw, dz. Should be the same relationships should apply as I was showing you for horizontal velocity and vertical velocity. Here's what you see. The dashed lines again are Garrett Mug spectrum. This dW, dz is a little higher than Garrett Mug. The shear is a lot higher than Garrett Mug, and there's no energy above n, and no data above n really, because we couldn't sample that fast. If you take the dW/dz spectra and you convert it to du/dz and dv/dz, using the consistency relations, you get the black curve. That's not the same as what's observed. In other words, for these high wave number, small scale motions, it's not internal waves. It's something else. That's reassuring. There is something else in the ocean. What are they? The answer is that we don't know, and haven't known for decades, and known that we haven't known for decades. If you look at the vertical wave number spectrum, this is internal waves, as I was saying a few slides back. This is Kolmogorov turbulence, and in between there's this funny -1 region. That's what links the internal waves to the turbulence. That's how the internal wave energy gets from internal waves to turbulence, and we don't know anything about it. We don't know how it works. There's some new ideas on that, which I can talk about if somebody asks. And this seems like a very intriguing area to try to figure out what's going on. So as usual, I talk fast, and so I'm basically done, but that gives some interesting time for questions. Here's what I said, spun slightly differently. Background. Mixing in the stratified ocean interior is fundamentally different from that in 3D turbulence. The mixing is driven by internal waves that are generated by wind, tide, and eddies. We can parameterize that as using models of weakly interacting internal waves. And the important thing is that all the rates, energy flux, dissipation, and mixing rates are proportional to the square of the energy. And this contrasts with turbulence models where these rates are proportional to energy. Therefore, as I've talked about a lot, there's a transition from waves to turbulence at some energy level, just the energy level, and the energy level is roughly when the RMS wave velocity equals the phase speed of the lowest mode, and that happens at quite high energies in the open ocean. If you can learn quite a bit about this, and you can learn quite a bit about the nature of the motions by looking at frequency spectra of Lagrangian velocity. I showed you some examples from Night Inlet in the open ocean. At low energy, these diagnostics show that there's internal waves with not very much turbulence. At high energies, it's much more confusing. Motions with frequencies below n are consistent with internal waves. Motions with frequencies above n are consistent with turbulence, but the overall energetics agrees with stratified turbulence models. A and C are inconsistent. What the heck is going on? I don't know. I showed you an example from the Oregon Shelf, which showed that this doesn't apply on the small scales. At the 1 meter scale, it's not internal waves. These motions on these scales are how internal waves mix, break, or do something to become turbulent, and we don't understand that dynamics either. I was motivated to resurrect these old ideas because it seems to me that these are very powerful diagnostics that address fundamental issues, and I know of no papers other than what I just told you where these techniques have been used to diagnose either laboratory, field, or numerical studies. And I'm hoping to encourage some. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to have some questions.
Thanks for this very interesting talks. So we have time for questions. So it can be on the chat, or you can turn on your microphone. And I can start because I have a question about, looking at your summary, you do not discuss a lot on the influence of the Coriolis frequency. Maybe it's because it's much smaller than n, but does it have an influence? I guess if you do the measurements on the pole on the equator, you do not have exactly the same spectrum.
Yeah, so in terms of internal wave spectra, it's dominant. In other words, most of the say something like half the energy in a canonical internal wave field is in this inertial peak. And that's true both for the energy containing scales, which you would measure by measuring velocity, or the shear. The shear is dominated by near inertial frequencies also. So if you're going to talk about internal waves and mixing, the fact that it's inertial frequency dominated is really important. That even breaks some of the relationships about instabilities, which is another topic. So yes, it's critical. I didn't talk about it mostly because I was using data from a place that went in Night Inlet, for instance, that it doesn't seem to fit. And maybe that's the flaw in this whole argument. I don't know.
Okay. There is a question in the chat. I guess it's, I try to read the question. I get, is it some comment on breaking internal waves? It was the question that was asked.
About breaking internal waves?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So let me go here. The standard answer is how you get from, so this has to do with this question right here. How do you get from here to here? The standard answer appears to be, has been that it's internal wave breaking, which is a rather weak, which is a sort of a poorly phrased thing. The details matter. And let's see, I'll go here. Okay. The problem with that is that internal waves should start breaking at these sort of 10 meter scales. That's where the Richardson number gets to be small enough that you should start getting a lot of internal wave breaking. And yet you don't really start to see the turbulence. The large eddy scale of turbulence is typically an order of magnitude smaller. So you have to span this range here. The new idea that's come up is that possibly this regime is what's called, so we don't know the answer to the question. You certainly have examples of breaking internal waves in the ocean, but it's not clear that that's the dominant process. There's a new idea floating around that Eric Kunze has been promoting, which is that this region here is dominated by what's called anisotropic turbulence, anisotropic stratified turbulence, which are interleaving shear layers that are, which is two-dimensional turbulence in each layer. So there's a cascade in the horizontal, but not in the vertical. And those flows are quite strong in the atmosphere also, very different environment, and have a -1 spectrum. And so it's possible that there's some very unique processes that happen here, which we haven't explored very well. They're just beginning to be explored. But it doesn't seem like there's a clear deterministic answer about breaking internal waves. If you look at where, for instance, in this sort of picture, what's going on in these patches, that was a very active area of research in the 70s and particularly in the 80s. And as soon as this framework began to get developed, where you don't care what this process is, you substitute fixed mixing efficiency, all that research was dropped. And so the question of how internal wave breaking works in the ocean, how you get from 10-meter scale to 1-meter scale, I think is a really critical question. And it's how you need to address the question of what mixing efficiency in the ocean is. I'm not quite sure I answered it, but I hope that was interesting.
Yes. There is another question by Amit. The question, what mechanisms do you think exist between 1 to 20 meter? You said you have some ideas. Would Lagrangian, LES and Lagrangian tools within work, or do we need DNS?
The critical, so the question is, so we're focusing in on this region. The critical issues to do a good simulation to get from this range to this range is to get the forcing right, to get the forcing from here to here. The energy flows this way. I think this region here could be perfectly well simulated by LESs. It seems to be, has universal spectra, all that stuff. So it's probably, this part can probably be done with LES. The critical thing is to set up realistic forcing at this scale so that you get the right mechanisms that get from the internal waves to whatever's going on here. And this region could be covered by LES. And it's possible someone's done that, but I have not seen that being done. And I'm encouraging such research.
Okay. Thanks for this answer. There's two other questions. That was the first one by Jitendra. Will there be regions of enhanced regions of turbulence or wave energy along an isopycnol? Will the spectrum looks almost similar along various isopycnols?
Okay, so it would certainly be true. I think I'm answering the right question. If you were to sample this little piece of ocean here, very carefully, where there's no breaking, you would not see any turbulence at all. It would look very, very weak. You just see weak non-wave wave interactions. On the other hand, if you were to sample this part of the ocean or this part of the ocean here in great detail, you would probably, since it is overturning and mixing, you would see something that locally was above what was turbulent and looked like some form of stratification influence turbulence. So that's the patchiness of this. That's part of this story. That's a great big part of this story. And another one of the weaknesses in this whole framework is the flow is really intermittent. Nowhere in this framework does this concept of intermittency appear. That seems to be another great weakness. And it's going to show up in this part. So there's going to be lots of variability between different places, and understanding that, and whether or not you, for example, there's ideas that you make a patch of turbulence here and it makes a little mixed piece of water. Then that mixed piece of water spreads out. And so it actually, if you sat over here, what you would see would be the remote influence of other mixing patches until this part mixes. And maybe that's what makes this place mix later. In other words, you make a little bleeny of water, it spreads it over here, and that shear makes this place break. That's essentially Eric Kunzer's idea, among other things. So that was close to an answer, I think.
Yes, that's good. Thanks for this answer. The second question was by Adèle Moncuquet. What are the differences in spectrum, especially wave turbulence transition between coastal and abyssal ocean?
So I don't have a real good answer. I don't have a real good answer to that. It's an excellent question. Look this way. In this story here, more or less, I've skipped over. There's a very nice paper, which is Jen McKinnon's PhD thesis, where she tried to address that question. The wave turbulence transition concept, at least the way I phrased it, didn't exist at that time. And in that case, the parameterization doesn't go as it wasn't wave-wave interaction. It was the interaction between small internal waves and, I believe, larger scale tides. And if you have a big peak in the spectrum, like at the tide, as you often do in shallow waters, then the interaction can be between the tide and the wave level. So that it was actually ended up in Jen's work actually being linear in the waves, nonlinear between the tide and the waves. And it might be really useful to re-explore that within the framework of these ideas. So it's different, and I can't speak authoritatively of how it's different. There may be work on that. I'm not familiar with it.
Okay. Can you spell the name of the author of this thesis, please? I think it's Jennifer McKinnon. I think
it's there.
Okay.
This was a bit. It was basically a project that she got funded and put a big team together, looking at the fine scale parameterizations and working through all their implications. It's a really nice piece of community work, really filling out this whole part of the picture.
Okay.
That wasn't her thesis, but I'm sure she referenced her thesis. It would be amazing if she didn't.
Okay. There's another question in the chat by Jim Thomas. Some of the recent papers, mostly relying on theory on idealized numerical simulation, point out that the vertical or the geostrophic mode plays an important role in setting up the wave spectrum. At scales where you said linear waves dominate, was there any indication of the vertical mode affecting the wave spectrum?
Okay, so what he said is exactly right, and in particular, the nonlinear wave interactions appear that they can be enhanced in the presence of geostrophic flows. There's some really nice papers showing that, and so it's a little bit more complicated than exactly this. The waves of the geostrophic flows are playing an important role in both ways, and I haven't talked about that, but it seems like the basic picture is still pretty much the same. You still get a Garrett Mug spectrum, even if the geostrophic modes are playing an important role here, which I did neglect to say, and I have not explored that, but they're going to be variations of these ideas, I'm sure.
Okay. Thank you for the answer. Is there any other question? I think there is no other question, so we can thank Eric and all the speakers of this session again.